Hey everybody, welcome to this edition of the Wild, Wise and Worthy podcast. Today I'm actually interviewing Dave Hompes. He will give a brief introduction of himself shortly, but before we begin, I need to read a disclaimer. So the content of this podcast is provided for psychoeducational and informational purposes only. The views expressed by myself and my guest are based on personal experience, perception and research. Any references to events, organisations, or teachings are not intended as statements of fact about any individual. Nothing in this podcast constitutes legal, medical, or psychological advice. The material is offered in the public interest to contribute to education and awareness and should not be relied upon as professional advice of any kind. So, Dave, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Kelly. It's good.
You're
It's
welcome.
good to see you again after so many years.
Yeah, definitely. Dave and I were what we say colleagues of some description in the human behaviour world, and we've known each other probably I think I first met you in 2013 in Houston,
Yeah,
in
that's about
Texas.
right. Definitely.
One of the teachings that we both attended inside of the organisation that we both attended most for many years as well. So, Dave, do you want to give a brief introduction of who you are?
Yeah, I'll be very quick.
Perfect.
I was a sports scientist at university in the 90s, studied sports science to master's level, and then had an awakening with a teacher, a holistic health teacher, a couple of years later after I'd graduated, who basically blew out of the water everything that I thought I knew from university. And his name is Paul Check, and he's out of California, San Diego area. And so I did a lot of holistic health education with him. Got myself into personal training, nutritional counselling, etc. Did that for about 5 or 6 years. Then had a few of my own health challenges, and then I got into something called functional medicine, because that was the modality that helped me overcome my own health challenges. So I ended up with a lot of digestive problems, feeling depressed and anxious, skin problems, things like that. And working with a functional medicine doctor, again in California actually, helped me overcome those symptoms. At which point I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to train in functional medicine. So I've been doing functional medicine now since 2007. So coming up to 20 years. I wouldn't say I got bored with it, but I had some experiences with clients who did not do very well with functional medicine alone. And by sort of serendipity around 2012, 2013, realized that the mind can have, whatever the mind is, can have a profound impact on physical symptoms. A couple of my clients improved quite dramatically without any supplements or dietary changes, or breathing exercises or anything, just from changing the way they looked at life. And I was able to help them through some of that process because of what I'd learned from some CDs that I'd picked up by the leader of the organization that you and I met under. And so that was a real big awakening for me, that the mind and body have a really significant influential role on one another. I don't really see that we need to split mind and body now. It's more of we are psychosomatic unities. It's difficult to split the two. That's a hangover from Rene Descartes and Plato and what have you beforehand, that the mind and body are somehow separate when actually they're really the same thing, manifesting in different ways. That's really what the modern neuroscience literature would have us believe anyway. So then I engaged or embarked on a whole bunch of education through said organization. And that's where I met you, obviously. And over time, I would say the first 2 or 3 years, things went quite well with life in many ways. But then there was a bit of a stutter. And, since then, things haven't gone so well. And the reason you and I are here to speak today is to throw around some of the ideas as to why some of these self-development, self-help, personal development programs might not be quite all they're cracked up to be. And so I've had some difficulties. You and I got back in touch March, April time, something like that. I think I
Yeah, I think
posted
around
on
that time.
Facebook. I'd been feeling not myself for quite a long time, really, and I posted on Facebook um, that I'd had a tough time, and then you reacted to that post, and I got it. For some reason, I got in touch with you. I think I went and had a look at a couple of your posts. I thought, I've not heard from Kellie for ages. I'll go and see what she's up to, and then you had your whole story of what's happened to you over the last 3-4 years, and I thought, blimey, you've had a harder time than me. But I wanted to get back in touch with you to have a chat, and that's where you and I started to connect a
Yeah.
huge number of dots, and so it got around 2018, 2019. My partner Dominica basically started teasing me and saying, you're talking about this mode of being, this personal development model or school, and the leader all the time, and you seem to be a bit obsessed with it. And I realized that also in conversations with other people, when they'd ask me questions about how I got to know what I know and do what I do, I'd be saying, oh, such and such a said, and such a said, and oh, I learned that from such and such a. It just happened to be that such and such a was the same person. Now, because I come from a research background in university and what have you, and in the past have learned from lots of different people, I realized it wasn't particularly healthy to be citing the same source of information over and over and over again, that there was something not quite right there. So at the back end of 2019, I just started buying books. The book, the bookshelf goes quite a long way down
Look at that.
down the wall,
Wow.
and they've all been read, bar maybe 2 or 3% of them. And just slowly but surely, month in, month out, I started to realize that what I'd been taught in this self development organization wasn't necessarily true, shall we say. Yet it
Yes.
had been, yet
Yes.
it had been taught with such certainty and veracity that I had bought into it almost wholesale. Luckily, I got out. The reading got me out, and so it was 6 years of reading, gradually unwinding my involvement and connection to this organization, um, and then meeting you, and then you coming at it from a completely different angle from where I'd been. I'd kind of detached myself intellectually from it, but then there was a whole new area of exploration, which was the idea of organizations as cults, and individuals with narcissistic personality disorder and similar, and and putting everything together was both highly liberating and highly disturbing and difficult at the same time. And I had a mini health collapse earlier this year, nervous system freezing, enormous fatigue, massive anxiety whilst lying frozen on the bed, unable to summon the willpower to actually do anything. Aches and pains in the body, a huge, definitely over the last couple of years, a much greater propensity to pick up colds and flus and COVID than I'd ever had before. And when I made all of these realizations and sort of worked through all of this, all the symptoms disappeared. That was
Interesting.
interesting.
That's
So I kind
really
of got into
interesting.
that organization because of the methodology that actually seems to be able to help people
Mm-hmm.
overcome physical symptoms using the mind, using cognitive exercises. But then at the end of that journey, having the reverse happen, realizing that being heavily involved with that organization somehow psychologically and neurologically had created problems as well, and then detaching myself from it resolved all those symptoms. And they weren't, those symptoms were pretty, some of them were quite worrying, like heart palpitations. Had some aches and pains in my hips as well. Also had a jaw imbalance where I couldn't keep my mouth open at the dentist because the masseter muscle in the side of my mouth, in the jaw, was just too tight. And all of that went away upon realizing with horror what seems to be going on in the organization underneath the facade of it. And so
This
that's
is
that's
this is really interesting to me because what you're saying is some very similarities to what occurred for myself as well on I'm going to say waking up to the realization that um, there is, possible contraindications to the self-development organization. And this is one of the things that I think that really needs to be discussed, not overall, is that the human potential movement, the self-development movement, is ungoverned and seems to play into all these different areas like psychology, neuroscience, um, the psychobiological aspect, even the health components, and making many claims that they can actually integrate or transform these particular things that may be happening for people. And for me, I felt like I'd found like the secret sauce when I was in there,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that was all consuming, and that's a whole other layer of discussion around it. But I'm really curious and interested, like with your perspective around like your research that you have done since this, and you and I have been talking for a while, relative to these particular things, and the research around like that mind body connection and the neuroscience, and yourself as a functional medicine practitioner, the things that you have been able to discover that aren't true, that really do need to be discussed and brought into the light.
yeah. And it is a multi-layered conversation.
Mm. Hmm.
It probably, as you and I have chatted beforehand, it's probably going to take a couple, maybe even three
Yep. Yeah.
sessions to pick it all apart and unpack it, because there's so much. And I want to preface it by saying, look, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a neuroscientist or a psychologist, but I've read a hell of a lot in those areas. There is a big difference between learning information by description, just learning it rote and learning it cognitively, than actually performing a service for somebody, in terms of therapy or whatever, when it comes to psychology. But um, I've seen enough and experienced enough in my own body to be able to talk about it with at least a little bit of authority. So I like to say to people, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I love to learn about neuroscience. I'm not a polymath, but I like to read polymathically. I'm not a philosopher, but I like to read about philosophy. And so
Sure.
I don't want to label myself as anything other than somebody who's curious to find answers to struggles and difficulties that I've had in my own life. And I'm just lucky that I do come from a scientific background and a research background at university, which I
So,
think is really important.
if I can ask you a question, like you did mention that when when you had a realization that with all these physical symptoms that were happening in your body, and I'm guessing that you chose to refrain from actually, you know, using that methodology even further, and that then the symptoms actually disappeared, and that was the check of
Yes,
what was it that really got you to reconnect to your body. Because for myself, I noticed that because it is such an intellectual, uh, mind mesmerizing methodology, that there were seemed to be a disconnect from the mind to the body, um, in terms of the my what happened for me was that I felt like I had lost all sense of feeling, and I was no longer connected to the emotional sensory body. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. It's an interesting. I'll answer that in two parts. First of all, probably a couple of years ago, when I started to realize there's definitely something going on here. I really do not feel like myself. I really don't. And I traced that back to at least 5 or 6 years. But it was 2 years ago when I really started to wonder what was going on, because things were occurring in my life that I knew I should be and needed to be doing something about. But I could only think about them cognitively without any sense of emotional attachment to them, or any sense of urgency, or any sense of value. And so I think probably what we want to do in the second part is begin to unpack the idea of what self is and or is not. Because with respect, you're never taught any of these fundamental uh, uh, topics within these environments, these self-development, personal development environments, you're flooded with tons of information, but nobody actually gets down to the nitty-gritty and says, well, actually, what does psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy have to say about what a self is, or what it does? Why is it there? Those questions are never answered. Same with emotions. What is an emotion? You
What is the
realize that when you
purpose?
start asking, what's an emotion? What's a feeling? How do feelings
Yes.
and emotions differ? What is affect? What is mood? How do you tease apart what emotion, feeling, affect, and mood are? Nobody does this,
They
and
just
nobody
seem to
really.
they just seem to actually give you like a fix it for these
Yeah,
moods or these behaviors or your emotions. What is the buzzword? Regulating your emotions. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and that sounds very much like Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis. Yeah, and so in his book, the Descartes Error book, he tells that case study, doesn't he, of his patient? They call him Elliot, and Elliot's had some brain damage to the emotional centers, and it's the medial prefrontal cortex, or ventromedial VMPC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, I think, that's taken a hit in that patient, and it just so happens that the VMPC is important for our sense of self. It lights up a lot when we're thinking about ourselves, but it's also very important for integrating emotions from the other emotional centers, which are deemed to be lower or inferior, like the amygdala, for example. But the cortex is very important still in emotion. But when it's been taught this stuff, you're given the idea that the prefrontal cortex is purely cognitive and rational, but it's not. It's heavily involved in constructing emotional timbres and reactions and responses to what's going on. Now, in this particular case study, Elliot has had part of that section of his brain damaged, and he passes all of the cognitive tests that they throw at him. So, like, his IQ and intelligence is still completely intact. But when it comes to actually making decisions and planning for things in his life, he can't do it. He just keeps going round in circles because there's no valence or emotional attachment to any particular decision in one direction or another. And he just basically becomes a very hyper rational, intelligent zombie, if you like. He can't make decisions to go anywhere in his life. Now, that is exactly how I have felt. So I wanted to figure that out. But I can remember reading this case study and going, this is not what we are taught in the environment in which we have spent a lot of money to be in. So I bought all of Damasio's books, and then anything I could find on neuroscience, not the technical stuff, but as much of the popular stuff. All of these authors are technical neuroscientists, but they found a way of communicating to the masses their concepts. And so that was really shocking for me. Yeah, it's awful, actually. Now, when I had these realizations in speaking with you earlier this year, I then went to 3 or 4 people I introduced to the particular learning environment we're speaking about, and they also had found that their lives had flatlined a little bit. And when I explained all of this to them, they all went, "Shit, that's exactly, you've just described me. You've just described it. I get it now." So I've been liaising with them as well to help them understand, and they are all in the same boat. Now, what's interesting is we can use like a solar system analogy with this. If the organization or the leader of the organization is the sun, then different people are going to be pulled into different orbits that go closer or further away from the sun in the organization. You can be a student who just dips in and out now and again and doesn't get too involved, and that would be like Neptune or something like that, way out in the outer rings of the planetary system. Or you can get drawn further in to get close, like Venus and then maybe even Mercury, or somewhere intermediate in between. I think I was probably at about Earth or Mars level. The other guys were a little bit further out, but you were further in. You were way into the Mercury orbit around the leader. And so it's like the closer you're in, the harder it's going to be to get out. because the pull is so strong, but also, you've by definition, by being that close, and you've dedicated more of your energy, your life, yourself to that cause at the expense of anything else that you may have wanted to be getting on with as well. Now that's not neuroscience. That's just a metaphor to try and help people understand what might be going on. And I think you had a horrific time that you can't even people can't even begin to understand. I can get a tiny way into how you must have felt because of how I felt, and the guys outside, who I've been speaking to, weren't quite as affected as me, but they still had this sort of flattening of their life, sort of nothing matters, can't seem to find any drive. I've lost my drive, one of them said, and another one said, I got out because I felt like I was losing my life force. That's a pretty hectic statement for somebody to make. But it seems to be that this is a lot more common than people give it credit for. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about the idea of the self. You can come at the idea of self through any number of different avenues, and you're going to get a different answer. So you can come at it from the perspective of theology and religion, and then the different religions around the world. You can come at it from philosophy. You can come at it from sociology, psychology, and neuroscience, or even biology. So you can come at it from many different angles, evolutionary biology as well. And it's not an easy thing to unpack. But I think personally, before we go in and start to try and explain things through speculation, through theology and religion and things like that, we should really pay attention to what the science says. And no, science doesn't have the answer for everything, but it does have some pretty good answers. And it would be wise to start there before going out and trying to explain things with mysticism and a whole bunch of hullabaloo that doesn't really necessarily have any grounding in reality. Yeah, rather than just be made up. Yeah. That's a very difficult question to answer. And I'm not sure science can answer all of that at the moment. There's we are mysteries still. There's still a lot of mysteries that are within us and around us. And it's a difficult one to answer, but there are some great books out there on this. There's a good book called The Ego Trick by a contemporary philosopher called Julian Baggini. And that was a very helpful book for me because he basically breaks it down and says, there are kind of two real ways of looking at a self or the self. One of them is kind of the essence view, that there is a core essence to each of us. And that takes you along the lines of the more religious and some of the philosophical definitions of self, which is a soul, right? There's a soul, and that is the essence of us. Then there's something called bundle theory, which is that the way the brain makes connections with all its different parts and working functionality, and the way it interacts with the body and the outside world is what gives rise to a sense of self. But there isn't really an essence or a center. It's an emergent phenomenon from all of this activity of the nervous system, brain, body, and its interactions with the environment, particularly with other people. And so those two are kind of the fundamental models that argue with each other through time, all the way back to at least Plato and beyond. And also Buddhism, for example, is more on the bundle theory side of things. So you have Buddhism says there isn't an essence to us, that our sense of self is constructed. Neuroscience says our sense of self is constructed. It's a cognitive construction. And so there's an argument here. Now, the way this ties in with what, the personal development scene is, again, nobody ever stops to teach you any of this or introduce you to the debate. No, to get right down into the nitty gritty and ask you these questions from sort of first principles levels. You go in there and you're told you're at a self-development course or a self-improvement course, but nobody ever tells you what the self is. Right? So it's like, whoa, well, how can you improve something if you don't even know what it is? Yeah, it's bizarre. And so there's There's an amazing book. The Ego Trick is really good by Julian Bagini. There's a proper textbook, an academic scientific textbook called The Handbook of Self and Identity. And that one was a revelation for me to read. It's like 750 pages of double column text. Well, there were many of them. The first one would be, and this is a revelation I've had over and over again in different areas of research, that the environment that we were in, the school that we were learning with, omitted enormous amounts of important information about self, neuroscience, etc. It's cherry-picked information to support the model that they want to push, with and anything else that disagrees with that, or that may even leave a paper trail or a trail of crumbs to something that may cause students to become dissonant and start to question that school's belief. It seems to me to be strategically left out of any teachings. So that made me angry. That really, because that's intellectual dishonesty of the highest level. It's basically charlatanism. And I'll quite happily say that there's charlatanism and almost intellectual fraud going on with this stuff, because the stuff that's left out is super important and helpful. It's been revelatory to me. I think in that book, though, to answer the question directly, there's a chapter by a neuroscientist at the University of California, and his name is Stanley Klein. And you can get the paper online actually as well. We could maybe even put it in the links in the show notes for anybody who's interested. It's a great paper, and in that paper he lists 8 bullet points of neurocognitive requirements for a human being to have a sense of self, or that really impact or influence a sense of self. And 4 of those 8 bullet points are semantic memories about semantic understanding about the world around you and how we relate to it. Semantic understanding about your own traits and your character, your emotions, and the most important one that I've just forgotten, episodic memories. Episodic memories in the past of specific events that you were involved in, self-referential memories there. Now, you and I both know that the core method used in the school that we are principally discussing, although this seems to also have been the case in things like Scientology and the NXIVM organization, which were deemed as cults, right? The methods they use are very similar. They're like an archipelago. They're all cut from the same bedrock, but they stick up out of the sea in different places as different islands. But if you dig back down into them, the methodology is very, very similar. So the method we used is very similar to auditing in principle in Scientology, and also the exploration of meaning in NXIVM. Now it goes straight for the jugular. The method we use goes for your traits. That's the first thing it does. Your episodic memories relating to those traits, trying to get your emotions in check, and then the whole teaching system is going straight in and drastically altering your semantic understanding of what you are, who you are, other people, your relationship to them, and the rules and laws that govern the world, the universe, and life in general. So over the course of 2 days, you have been flooded and bashed to smithereens with all of this new information that completely upends your understanding of yourself, other people, and the relationships between them. And all of that is done without you giving permission. It's labeled as something that helps yourself develop, as a breakthrough, for example. And they all use the word breakthrough somewhere, all of these different organizations. Breakthrough. So it's always there, to some kind of higher level of functioning. Ultimately, yeah. That was the bit that you gave me, because I didn't have that piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And then when it all just came together, when I fully understood that. Yeah. Well, you're backed into that corner at the seminars that you can't get out. You have to go with the flow. And then at the time, I think this is another really important. I've got to circle back to that. Let me circle back to that bit just quickly. Finish off what I was going to say is, if you're still in the organization and you're watching this now and you're still using the method, I don't have a problem with using the method as long as the downsides are actually acknowledged and people aren't forced to keep doing it over and over and over and over again. Because anytime you do it, you are reinforcing and reactivating your attachment to that particular worldview, which isn't necessarily a healthy thing. And I think we'll come on. Sorry, yeah, because totally, yeah, because if you're, well, sort of reverse engineer it. If your sense of self is reliant upon your semantic understanding of yourself and the world and your traits and characteristics, which have developed over time, since you were a child, since you were a baby, and then your episodic memories and your emotions, if all of those have become part of who you are and what you are as your sense of self, and you go in and disturb those with a series of questions and exercises, how can it not be causing disturbance and perturbation in a person's sense of self? Because you're going in there and you're taking some of the core aspects of what is needed to form a sense of self in the first place, and you're going in there and you're jiggling them around quite significantly, and you're doing that without letting people know what's going on. Now, there's also this idea of true sense of self, authentic sense of self. I find that one very difficult to discuss. I think it needs unpacking probably in another episode, but there are certain aspects of myself where I feel like, and I think everybody gets this at some point, maybe even most people go through something like a midlife crisis, which is what I thought all of this was initially, where you think to yourself, I'm not really doing what I should be doing here. Something inside you says, I've spent 50 or so years doing this, but I don't feel like that's who I am, and I want to go here instead. That's something that's very difficult to explain for me. I like the Jungian psychology explanations for that, which I won't go into here. But maybe there is some kind of sense of self that we are here for something, for some kind of purpose, and we should be doing something else with our lives rather than what society expects of us and our family of origin expects of us. Where does that sensation go of I'm not quite in the right place here come from? That's a very difficult one for neuroscience to explain, I think, at the moment. But if we go back to the idea of self, when you and I started going to this self-development school or any of the other seminars and schools that are out there, a lot of people would ask, well, how the hell did you not? You're talking about this now in hindsight, but how did you get pulled into it in the first place? And I think this also needs unpacking, because there's another way of looking at the self, which I think it was William James who first brought this up. There may have been people before him, but he was certainly one of the people who popularized it, in that there's a sense of I and there's a sense of me, and they're not the same. And so that I would be the self as a knower, and the me is a sense of self as known. So knower, I don't mean like Noah as in Noah's Ark, but Knower, knower, and that would be in Stanley Klein's terms, that would be called the ontological self, and the me would be the epistemological self. And so we don't need to necessarily unpack those terms, but I would say to any of the people who are in this school at the moment to go away and research what ontology and epistemology actually are and what they mean, because again, they're just terms again that are never actually laid out on the table, philosophical terms. But the self as I is the experiencing self. I'm having the experiences. I wake up in the morning and there I am. There the world is, and I am having an experience. Yeah, sure. And again, different models depending on the researcher or the author that you read. But Damasio is a very good starting point. He says that there's a proto-self, first of all, in what we might call primitive organisms, which is we don't want to demean organisms that are prior to us in the evolutionary process, but you call them primitive, and they have very simple ways of navigating the world through valence, positive and negative valence, stimuli to move towards and stimuli that they want to move away from. And then as cellular life developed, you now get the predator-prey dynamics, whereby you're moving away from predators because they're going to eat you, and you're moving towards food because you need it to survive. And in these more primitive organisms, it's that dynamic that gives rise to this proto-self, which doesn't have any consciousness attached to it, according to Damasio. And then as you move through evolution and the brain and the nervous system and brain start to develop, you get something called the core self. And that's really just an extension, when you look at it, of the proto-self. But now you might start to get the dim origins of self-consciousness in organisms, like a feeling that it is to be alive, sort of thing. And then when you get to the so-called highest level, you get the autobiographical self, which is where humans are at as the pinnacle or paragons of at the moment. But it still runs on the same principles. The principles are still all about whether you want to move towards something or away from something based on your own felt needs and goals. And those feelings come from the emotional activity of your body. And this is where actually going through some definitions of emotions would be helpful at these courses, because there are at least 21 different, very well thought of or very well argued definitions of what an emotion is, and people disagree. So there isn't actually an agreement on them. At the school we're in, the emotion is called distortion in the fabric of space-time. I mean, that's just fucking ridiculous. We're going to smuggle in some physics and suggest that an emotion is really a process that has a basis in physics and not within the lived body. Yeah, it sounds, you think you're privy to really cool information, but actually there's a form of mystification here and word salad that the way it's presented gives you a way of bridging it and thinking, yeah, that's possible. I can see how that might be possible. Before you know it, you've taken that in and sort of internalized it. But actually, going back to emotions and feelings, some say emotions go all the way back. They call these reactions and responses to environmental stimuli, whether these organisms consciously experience them or not, as emotions. So even things like the urge to go to the toilet might be considered an emotion. That's Derek Denton. He calls it I think it's primordial emotions in the book. And that's kind of how Damasio refers to it. Then the feeling of those emotions comes along. So you're actually conscious of the feelings, and then you become a human being, and now you've got all sorts of complexity on top. But if you're going in there and you are trying to equilibrate your emotions constantly, I think that's a really major problem, because the way the body's set up is that the brain receives input from signals from the body, and it receives input from the world outside, and it has to somehow combine those and prioritize them and then act on them. And those actions can be completely unconscious, where signals arise in the body, hit the brainstem. The brainstem responds without you being aware of any of this happening, sends signals back down into the body to create some kind of change that is required. Or it can become conscious emotionally, or we can start to think about it more rationally and cognitively. They're all really levels of the same processes. And they're already there to self-correct and keep the body in homeostasis. If you go in and start messing around with those, there's a problem. Now, I'll put a caveat here. I think everybody agrees, in this circle of discussion that we have, that there's some value in taking somebody who has a real block or a stuck place in their life and using methodology to get them over that hurdle as a one-off, or maybe using it a couple of times, and then thank you very much, goodbye. That's worked great. I feel a lot better. I've really had a breakthrough there, and now I'm gone. It's when that process becomes framed as the only way to proceed with solving problems in your life, and this is the only way to view life. This is actually how the universe works, how you operate. And if you don't use these methods, then you're some kind of inferior being. And it becomes the one true way. And it doesn't matter whether it's the organization that we were in, whether it's the NXIVM, or whether it's Scientology, or even some of the organized religions. they all function along this line, that our way is the one true way. Now, if you keep using it over and over and over and over again, if your body is designed to work through emotion and feeling, and all you're doing is trying to quash that constantly because it's deemed as an animal function rather than a true human function, just totally neglecting the fact that we are animals, as you said earlier, animals living on a planet with biology, etc. It's just bonkers, and you start to see this. We felt it. I certainly felt like I was turning into a bit of a zombie. We see this by observing people who are still in the system. Now, this isn't about people; it's about principles. And so you see this. You can observe how robotic and almost zombie-like some of them are. And the reason that's not projecting out and criticizing them, because we were in the same state. So once you've been in it and gotten out of it, you can look back at it and go, whoa, that was pretty much me. And once you're out, it's horrifying. But while you're in it, you don't know you're in it. And that takes me to the point of the self as knower, or I, and the self as known. While you're in the experience, it's like, as Robert Anton Wilson calls it, a reality tunnel. And you're having these experiences, you've been indoctrinated, and we don't use that word lightly, into a certain belief system. You don't realize that's happened until you're able to step outside it and observe it and go, shit, that really happened to me. And so that self as knower, I like to remember, I experimented with drugs and stuff when I was younger, had some ecstasy and stuff like that to go out partying. The first time you do something like that, you have this experience and you go, whoa, this is super, super cool. And you are the self as knower at that time, the I self having the experience. At no point during that experience, which feels really cool, are you stopping to epistemologically analyze how that is influencing your brain and nervous system. You're not going, oh yeah, now I've got a huge dopamine or serotonin rush from this, and it's causing my heart rate to go up, and blah blah blah, oxytocin, whatever's going on in the nervous system. You're just having a great time. And it's like that with these personal development seminars, LGATs, the large group awareness trainings. There's so many people having these experiences that you'd never stop to ask yourself, what's truly going on here in my brain and nervous system? How is it going to affect me over the long run? And of course, if you keep doing drugs, it's probably going to have a dramatically negative effect upon you at some point. And so the same thing is true with this. You get taken into this particular reality tunnel. With the drug, it wears off after a few hours, and you pop back out into reality. You go back, you keep going back, It's not going to do you much good. And the same thing happens with these seminars. I can remember finishing a 5-day seminar or whatever, and then feeling down for 2 or 3 days afterwards, and just wanting to hop on a plane again and go and do another one, to be back in that reality tunnel without any awareness of what was actually happening to my nervous system and my brain. The more I did it, and so I'm right there with you. You can't emotional flattening, I think, is the way that they put it in the literature. Your emotions are there for a reason, and if you become flattened emotionally, you won't be able to make decisions effectively. You may become a bit of a zombie, like I felt I became, and the other people that I've spoken to this have also commented on, and you've experienced. But there's a point also where you have a realization that this differential self, not self, that you've become, cult self they call it. I think Lalich calls it the cult self. Maybe we can speak to that in a moment. You realize that's not you, but you also realize an enormous amount has been invested in creating that cult self, and there becomes a dissonance between the true self and the cult self, and that dissonance, it creates symptoms. Yeah, yeah. And none of those people have gone in to join a cult, as Mark Vicente would say. It's like, we go in there because we believe we're going to get some really cool stuff to become better people, more effective people in life, that gives us what we want and allows us to help other people, and maybe just create a contribution that somewhere we can look back and think, at least in my tiny little way, I've made the world a better place. That's why we join. We don't join to become reformed cognitively, thought reformed, and almost brainwashed with this stuff. But ultimately, that is what happens, and it's hard to get out of that. There's so many emotions at play and feelings when this dissonance kicks in, as you explained: shame, some guilt, some embarrassment and humiliation. You wonder, how the hell did that happen to me? I'm supposed to be an intelligent person, at least a little bit. And then anger and resentment and rage that it's happened, that it's actually been done to you. And then it's, yeah, you have to work through that, and you're going to have symptoms, until that is dealt with. Yeah, 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 yeah. God, there's so much to unpack with that. So I think I like, yeah, I like to the way I framed this sort of from a metaphor or an image in my mind was to imagine that when you go into these organizations, and I believe I've been in 3 of them. It's just that the most recent one has been the big one, so to speak. But I think I've been in other ones, looking back and identifying the criteria. So when you get in there, you sort of, part of you dissociates somehow. As part of your brain shuts down or stops you from seeing things. And I don't really know how this works neurologically yet, but part of it sort of shuts down. But another part comes online that wasn't there before, if you like. Almost like a bubble comes out. If you imagine a bubble to the side of your head. And in that bubble, yeah, it's like a thought bubble. In that bubble, the rules of life are different. And they are the rules that are being taught or injected into you in the environment that you're learning from within that environment. And yeah, 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 yeah. Well, it's it's so difficult that that bubble, and this is common to all of the ones that I've studied now, with your help, looking into watching The Vow and watching the Holy Hell documentary. All these documentaries, Seduced, all of these are on Amazon for people to watch. The Vow would be the one that I'd start with. And then also listening to many podcasts now and listening to some of the experts that you've pointed me to speaking on this, that they all have some kind of ladder or bridge or structure for you to climb within the bubble. So the bubble has a different set of rules. Morality is changed, ethics are changed, all the rules of the universe, of how it works, how the mind works, etc., have all been changed from what we might call real life, or the life that most people lead, and the beliefs that they have. And you can ascend that ladder spiritually, so to speak, to reach a certain goal. And it costs you a lot of money to do that, usually, stage by stage. And you can learn to facilitate that process for other people. Right? It's the same in all of them. So it was the same in Nixium. You could become an EMer. It's the same in Scientology, where you can learn to do the auditing instead of having it done on you. You could be the auditor. And it's the same in the environment we were in, where you can become a facilitator. Lots of dynamics at play with that. In the early part of that, the first seminar, kind of the signature flagship seminar, what's happening is you are being flooded with massive amounts of information that you may have heard about vaguely at some point in your life. And there's a lot of name dropping. And it's pinging from philosophy to physics to psychology, whatever, to in between different subjects, with 2 or 3 self-evident laws or rules, like complementary opposites. Everything exists with its opposite, cannot exist without its opposite. The law of the one and the many. All of this sounds really fancy, and you will find it if you've got the AI with you while you're in the classroom. You can look it all up, and it is all there. So you go, "Oh, this is really cool," and so it's almost like the frame has been set within 4 or 5 hours of all of this constant flooding and so much name dropping. Einstein, Schrodinger, Heisenberg, Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, Niels Bohr, David Bohm, may even get people like Rupert Sheldrake in there. There's just so much constant information. You go, this guy knows his shit. It's like, wow, this is exactly what I've been looking for. Somebody who can pull together all of these disparate parts of information that I had floating around vaguely in my mind and concretize it into a model. Now, I'm pretty sure what's going on at that point is you're getting a lot of dopamine being produced in the nervous system, and it feels good. And everybody else around you, or pretty much everybody else, is feeling the same. And so you get chatting with them. And as Mark Vicente said when you interviewed him, you feel like you've found your tribe. You go, these are the people that I want to hang around with. So now there's a huge, the huge component of the social self becoming engaged. And I don't know about you, Kelly, but over time, I found myself constantly wanting to be with those people and not ditching, but distancing myself from my true friends who I'd grown up with and what have you, and hardly spending any time with them because they don't understand this stuff. And so, and it's like, and that's happening surreptitiously. It's so weird how this happens. But that's part of the thought reform and the brainwashing. Yeah. And that's the part of yourself living in that bubble. Yeah, that's the part of yourself living in that bubble. But there's still a part of you that's not in there. 100% of you never goes into that bubble. And it's when the dissonance starts to take hold between the two that you start to struggle. But you're exactly right. There's a smug sense of self-righteousness that you feel you've been exposed to this special knowledge and this method. That, let's face it, when you do the method, some interesting stuff happens. There's no doubt about it. There's stuff going on in your brain and nervous system when you use this method that can be very beneficial. But if it's overused and you buy into it 100% at the expense of everything else that you once knew, that's when you're in trouble. And so, yeah, that smug sense of self-righteousness, which you don't necessarily get arrogant and start throwing that at people, although that can happen. But you are the one who suffers as a result of it if you're not careful, because you subconsciously distance yourself from people because you can't have the conversations that you want to have with them because they are not in that world. And then 10 years of your life goes by and you go, shit, I never spent time with those friends. And it's really poignant for me that around the time that you and I started chatting, just before actually, one of my friends had a 50th birthday party. And I attended that, and I saw a bunch of friends who my last meeting was with around the time that I got into this education group. And I hadn't seen them for 11 years, 12 years. And it was extremely, I feel quite emotional talking about it now. Couldn't believe how much I enjoyed it. And then thinking, what the fuck was I doing for the last 11 or 12 years, not spending time with these people? And then it dawned on me, the horror of it dawned on me, that it was because I had that smug sense of self-righteousness that I didn't want to spend time with them because they were just normal people who didn't have this special knowledge. Now, I never have been able to identify that until afterwards, when you look back on it and go, that's what happened. But while it was happening, I had no idea that that's what was going on. So it's awful, really. That it's just tragic that can happen. They're more acquaintances than real friends. Yeah, without speaking in that lexicon, when you're in that group, in that bubble, all you're doing is speaking about the world in that vernacular. And you see this again on social media now. Again, just being very quick to point out that this is principles, not people, that I'm criticizing here. You see people just constantly communicating in this vernacular from the imaginal cult space. And they're using the exact language that the leader uses. And he's infiltrated them so much that there's very little, you don't know where they begin and he ends. Because all they do is communicate in his language and the exact sentences that he would use. And that is, it's like a possession. You say it's like a hypnosis. It's an infection. It's a possession. It's infiltration of some kind of entity. Now, it's also no coincidence that a number of the people who I have in mind are actually physically ill with this. They have autoimmune conditions, they have cancer. The people who are in that Mercury and Venus inner circle, they're not healthy people in general. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, the purpose of the immune system is, well, we could do a whole podcast on the immune system, but one of the main purposes, if not the main, is to recognize self from non-self or other, because that immune system has the potential to go and attack its own tissues, which is autoimmune disease. It has the potential to also not recognize non-self, which would be something like a cancer cell. And if it doesn't recognize cancer and destroy it, then cancer will proliferate and cause problems. So obviously, a cancer cell is slightly different. It's not strictly speaking non-self, because it's the body's own cells going wrong, but it's still kind of non-self. But that ability to discriminate self and non-self determines how effective the immune system is going to be. You know, very high level overview or statement there. Now, if psychologically you have a sense of self that is you, the authentic you, and you are allowing something else to bulldoze its way in, and you're accepting that the bulldoze is not really the right. The activity is bulldozing; it's bulldozing its way in, but it's done in such a way that you open up to it. It doesn't necessarily smash through closed doors. The doors are subtly open to allow it to get in, you know, through all the setup that goes on in the first morning of that particular seminar we're talking about. And that worldview, the bulldozer gets infiltrate through your nervous system down into your cells, etc. Your immune system, Francisco Varela, who's a very famous scientist / philosopher, and some of his colleagues, they basically determined or have a model that they refer to as the immune system being a cognitive system. They actually use that language. So it's a cognitive system, almost like a perceptual system, a sensory system. Now, if it senses, if there's something coming in there that is not self, which is somebody else's worldview bulldozing its way in, could it be that the immune system senses this and mounts a response? Is that why we see autoimmunity in some of the people who are in, you know, within the system? Is that one? You know, there are many reasons why autoimmunity may develop, but that might be one of them. And so that differentiation of self v non-self. So is the cult self in this bubble the non-self? Is the immune system having a hard time discerning, you know, the true authentic self from the cult self that has been developed as a result of the bulldozing that's gone on? All of these are, it's confused. It just in the same way that you and I have been speaking about ourselves being in confusion and conflict, is that physically represented by the autonomic activity of the nervous system going haywire and sending you into freeze responses and fight and flight and fawn, but also is it another level down into the immune system where the immune system doesn't know what the hell's going on? It can't discern self from non-self on a more metaphysical plane. The model that we have been had shoved into us, you know, people will understand what we mean by that. I think that's another. It's speculative, but it seems to ring true to me, because it was once I figured this out that all my symptoms just disappeared. It's like once I could cognitively play with them and start to analyze them with my conscious mind, I didn't need the symptoms anymore. The body, the immune system, the nervous system didn't need to try and let me know by giving me the symptoms. Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, you feel it. You just feel it. There's I can't remember the ins and outs of this, but there's another philosopher, there's a historian actually called I think Fernando Armesto or something like that. He wrote a book called Truth, and he speaks of 4 different truths. And there's the truth that you're told, which is the authoritarian. I'm going to listen to what people tell me and absorb that and take that on as the truth. There's also the truth that you feel. And that truth that you feel in your body is really important. And I think we've lost the ability to honor that as effectively as we should do, because we now live in a society and this is one of Guy Claxton's arguments and several others, that through the ages, from Plato probably onwards, the body has been seen as something that is just dirty and in the way. The body's in the way of the rational soul, the rational mind. We are trapped inside this stupid body with all its shitting and pissing and drives and puking and all of this stuff and its illness. And the soul is really the core of us, the center of us. That's what we should be focusing on, not this stupid thing called the body. And that was obviously reignited in the 17th century by René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." Maybe he should have said, "I feel, therefore I am." That might have been, yeah, exactly. The neuroscience, once it came along, started to usurp these older philosophical models that had basically plagued us. Like, they'd infected us, humanity as a whole, for 2,500 years, until neuroscience comes along and says, "Oh, hang on a minute, maybe this is a bit more like Buddhism, where the self is actually a construct and there isn't a soul." But then this takes you into the debate, doesn't it, that is never had in the school that we were part of, which is, you are told there is a soul, you are told there's a higher mind, and you're told there's a lower mind. Now, they are reifications. They're basically, and again, you're never told what a reification is. A reification in philosophy is something that is a concept or an idea that somehow we end up taking as a physical truth, something that is real and concrete, when in actual fact it's just a figment of our imagination, really. And so the lower mind is the animal mind that runs the body. The higher mind is an intermediary that has the potential to either listen to the body and be all emotional and all over the place, like the body, or it can listen to the soul and maximize its rationality by becoming balanced and equilibrated. And that then makes us more human. But actually, that seems to be the reverse of what the neuroscience teaches us. And in any way, the soul, they're all reifications. It's like you come out of these courses thinking, well, I have a lower mind, higher mind, and a soul. Where none of that is provable or proven, but you take it as given, and all the people who are still in this teaching it to other people still take this as given, when it's just it's Whitehead called it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is another name for it. But we were all there. It's not criticism, right? We were all there. We've been there doing this. So yes, yeah. Agree 100% with that. So I'm not against the idea that there might be a soul, right? And you and I have discussed that, but we are here in a body, and we're not getting rid of that anytime soon. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head, and people might want to also read the book The Hidden Spring by Mark Soames, which is a fantastic book. And he talks about the idea of zombies. And this takes us into more neuroscience, but the latest neuroscience models show us that what we perceive is as much of the construction of our brains creating a model of reality than it is of the outside world itself. So perception, Carl Friston, going back to Helmholtz and even going back to Kant, with his phenomenon-noumenon dichotomy, which is completely mistaught in the school that we were at. I just want to point that out. That's just the way that's taught. It's just bullshit. It's not what Kant meant at all. Is that how does the outside world get in? When we open our eyes, it's almost as if it's the same as when we're opening our curtains and all of a sudden the light comes in and we see everything. And that's not how it works according to the neuroscience models. The brain has a model, very complex model, that is the construction of which begins in infanthood. And then it predicts what it should be experiencing, and then measures those predictions of the model against the incoming sense data. And the perceptions that we have are to do with the errors between the predictions and the sensory signals, which is why things that surprise us carry more weight. So we go around unconsciously most of the time, not noticing anything. It's only when something perturbs that isn't the same as the model kicks in, like a car backfiring or something like that, that all of a sudden we get shaken. That's a very I'm not very good at explaining that yet, but it's in the hidden spring. Soames talks about the fact that if you, and this is where one of the things that really hit me, in the same way that if you equilibrate all your perceptions using the method we used, you would basically be minimizing or reducing or basically getting rid of all prediction errors in the perceptual system, and therefore you would become a zombie. There wouldn't be any sense of self or you if that happened. Now, I could do some more reading about that so I can explain it better. But if people want to go and have a look at it, sorry, carry on. 100%. And so one of the outcomes of me being in that particular state where I was kind of emotionally flattened was that my long-term relationship ended. And so I knew that was happening for a year. You know, it didn't end like that. It fizzled. And I knew it was happening. And I knew that I needed to do something about it. But I couldn't find any emotional motivation to stop that process in its tracks. So I was just like almost just wandering around, knowing it was happening, not wanting it to happen, but almost feeling resigned because I just couldn't muster any connection. That also happened with my business. So not just the romantic relationship, this also happened with my business, where I just lost the ability to be able to connect with any form of drive or enthusiasm to my business, and watch that go down the sinkhole as well and financially get into a bit of trouble. Same thing. And so when I started to talk to the guys in the US and here in the UK who I'm friends with from that organization, they all basically said that is exactly how I felt. Now, you and I both know that if we presented this argument to the inner circle facilitators or the haughty-taughty master, we would get something like this thrown back at us. You simply haven't done enough of the work. You haven't done the work properly. You don't know how to do the work properly. Let us help you. And by the way, it'll cost all this much. And that would be the stock answer, that you are the problem. The method cannot be the issue. And that's narcissism. That's absolutely flagrant narcissistic personality disorder response where no weakness can be shown at all. And that is exactly what would be leveled at us. That all of us, all of the people who are struggling, are simply not. None of you have done the work properly, right? And that's a self-sealing system. That's a self-sealing system. The only way out is to go back in. Yeah. And what happened with your help, with my understanding of this? You know, a lot of the intellectual stuff I distanced myself from already because I'd done so much research that I was able to spot in some of the advanced courses what had been included in those courses and what had been left out. And as I said earlier, some of the stuff that I'd read that had been super meaningful and helpful to me was just omitted. And yet it's some of the top contemporary neuroscience research. It was just never included. And so you go, well, there's got to be a reason why it's not included. And anyway, that's another story. But exactly what you've said was that this gaslighting, as it's known, that's the common term for it at the moment. I think there's another acronym called DARVO, and I can't remember what that stands for now. It's DARVO, and each of the bloody letters stands for a word, an action that the cult leader. Yeah. That's right. And so, what got me is that when I watched The Vow first, which was I read the book on cults by Rick Ross that you recommended. And as I was reading it, I was just going, oh my God, it describes exactly what's going on. So, yeah, there were a few lists of bullet points in that book where I was just ticking them all, going, yep. And then that was like, whoa, okay, need to breathe through that one a little bit. Then I watched The Vow. And within 20 minutes of the first episode of The Vow, there's a bit where it says, or I think it's Nancy Salzman, who is the number 2 in that organization, says, our leader has come to understand the human mind in a new and advanced way. It's a mathematical way. And as such, he's been able to create a scientifically reproducible method. And that is almost verbatim how the leader of the organization describes his method, that, the one that we were in. And then you watch the documentary and read the stuff on Scientology, and you go, he says the same thing. Again, it's like he's come to understand humanity in a new way with this new mind technique. And all three of them say, this is going to save you time and money because you won't need to spend, years and years in therapy. It's going to cut through all of that. Those people are no good. Just come and do this method that we have, and everything will in your life will turn to gold. Now, years later, people are spending thousands of dollars on continuing training courses with these organizations, having not gotten anywhere, but having actually been indoctrinated into a pseudo cult self, and in many cases being ill. It's like, whoa, yeah, and I agree. And you can't. It's like we have this segues onto quite a nice little section actually that just sprung to mind, which is, remember a lot of these schools teach the triune brain model by Paul MacLean from the 60s, where you've got the reptilian brain, which is basically the brain stem and a few of the other associated nuclei. Then you've got the limbic system, which is supposedly the mammalian brain. And then you've got the cortex, which is the seat of more rational stuff and evolves as we go through millions and millions of years of evolution. And that model's completely debunked now. And it's still taught pretty much everywhere. In the functional medicine space, when they're talking about stress and trauma, it's still taught. Even in the trauma world, with some of the world's leading trauma specialists, still talk about this triune brain as if it literally has three layers. But the research now shows that everything co-evolved, all the structures co-evolved, and the connectivity is what matters, not the supposed layers. And also within that, the reptilian brain, we never even evolved down the branch of evolution that humans evolved, never even was in touch with reptiles. There's no such thing as a reptilian brain in humans. Because the whole thing's just like pop psychology now. When you look at the evolutionary tree, humans did not evolve from the same line as reptiles. So to call it a reptilian brain is so ridiculous, it's not even funny. Now, where was I going with that? The proto-self, the core self, and the autobiographical self that Damasio talks about, again, aren't separate. They're all interlinked. And so your proto-self and your core self are warning you, and that's the body. So if you have those feelings in the body, that's your primordial self warning you that there is something going on. Just because you can't cognitively think about what that actually is, doesn't mean it's wrong. Like, I went through 2 years of having weird symptoms. They weren't terrible, but they were annoying, until everything became worse in March, April this year. And then, like you, when I was watching The Vow, I had massive freeze responses. I was lying on the bed, like watching the TV, not able to move, just going, fuck. This is brilliant stuff because I now know what happened, but my nervous system is saying, yeah, this is what has happened. It's like, whoa, this is definitely what happened. I knew there's nobody, and like the leader of the organization we were in says, it'd be impossible to convince me that ... Well, listen, prick, it would be impossible to convince me now that you are anything but a charlatan and that you are anything but a narcissist, and that your work does have harm. No matter how much positive spin you put on it, it can be very harmful to people. And then finally, one of the things we haven't talked about is this idea of the left and right hemisphere division of the brain, which is the area of specialization of Ian McGilchrist, who was not included at all, by the way, in the course on the brain and nervous system by said organizational leader. Yet the scope of McGilchrist's work is literally about 2,500 pages worth of hardcore neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, history all blended together polymathically with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of citations. Now, just so happens that the left hemisphere is much more associated with this defensive cognitive sense of self, and that the right hemisphere is older and is more associated with this embodied sense of self. Now, McGilchrist is very quick to point out that you can't make the dichotomy, the cut or separation is not that neat. Both the left and right hemispheres are involved in all functions to some degree, but it's the way that they function that differs. So they could be involved in the same task, but the way they go about those tasks is different. So the way the right hemisphere perceives the world and pays attention to the world is different from the way the left hemisphere pays attention to the world. So he uses a classic example to begin with, which is that in something like a pigeon, the left hemisphere is involved with finding stuff to consume, like seeds and bits of corn on the floor. So it's very hyper-focused. Whereas the right hemisphere is scanning broadly to make sure that predators are spotted and that it's not eaten. And he starts from that fundamental evolutionary perspective to teach us how the different hemispheres work and function in different ways. Now, the method that is taught in the school that we were at is basically a method that is almost wholly cognitive. It's all cognitive and hyper-focused. So you're only using one half of the brain. He claims that you're using and integrating the brain, but there's no evidence for that whatsoever. It's very highly cognitive. And, his entire model with the way that the teachings are set up are cognitive. It's all language-based. It's all semantic. It's training manuals of 1,000 pages with a few diagrams in there. But it's all two-dimensional, flat, semantically based teaching, which is the realm of the left hemisphere. So the whole organization slants you into a more left hemisphere version of the world. And that just happens to be where all the defensive strategies and confabulation tend to be located. According to Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, who did a lot of the original split brain stuff, Sperry got a Nobel Prize for it. But Gazzaniga says that there's a network or a circuit in the left hemisphere that he calls the interpreter, which is constantly weaving narrative and confabulations and things like that. And the whole thing in that school, there's lots more to say about this, but I'll cut it short, is all based on that kind of circuitry, really, when you think about it. And so, more neuroscience to say, well, we're going to get trapped in that left hemisphere if we're not careful and become dominant in that mode of functioning. The right hemisphere is where empathy tends to be more associated, which we're told is, an animal construct. We shouldn't really have empathy and compassion. Morals and ethics are in there as well. And so then we've got the points about the 8 bullets regarding neurocognitive requirements for a sense of self: traits, semantic understanding, episodic memories, emotions, all of which are faffed around with to a very large extent with this method. Then we've got the self as knower and the self as known, or the I and the me, which we never taught about. We never taught about what emotions and selves are. And that should be enough to get people to stop and ask themselves, whoa, there's something more maybe than meets the eye with this. So yeah, I think that's where I'm at with it. That well, I also I think it's I can't see how that is. I just don't see how it's even legal. If it was really dug into, if you've got a method that goes into those 4 areas of a neurocognitive sense of self and just goes straight in there, there's nothing. Because it's. I know when I'm working with people, I'm very upfront with people when I'm working with them, saying, look, we might use these supplements. We've picked up these results from the lab work that you've done with regard to your physiology, whether it's your gut, your hormones, your nutritional status, inflammation, immune activity, whatever it is. And I know from the experience that I've had even the most inert or innocuous supplement that scientifically, according to the body of literature that we have, should work for a given individual. They've got this set of results. We go, okay, this should work. Sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it makes them feel worse. And sometimes you get paradoxical responses from even the most innocuous of supplements, nutrients. And you have to be really wise to that. And that's just a tiny nutrient that your body needs. And so I'm very upfront to try and give people the potential risks so that we can coach our way through it and so that they feel safe, so that they understand that if their body doesn't quite feel right, or Dave said this might happen. And so there's a trust building process there. I'll let him know, and then we'll discuss what's going on and try something else. Try and figure out what's going on. And that is, there's a couple of things there. The recommendations that I tend to give always have a research background to them, so I can point people to that if they want to see it. 2, caution is the order of the day because humans are very complex. Whereas with this school and the industry in general, the self-help industry in general, it's just in there like a juggernaut. This method can only be helpful, it's only beneficial, it's only going to do you good. There are no harms or potential downsides and risks associated with it, which contradicts the core teaching of the one that the school that we were in, which is that everything has an equal and opposite benefit and drawback. So the core teaching is violated by saying that the method is only beneficial and that there can't be any downsides to it. That should be as big a red flag as you can possibly find for anybody who's involved. Yeah, I think it's the informed consent, as you mentioned. I think the idea that you go into these seminars under the impression that you're going to be helped, that there is no downside, that there's no warning. The drugs always come with a list of potential side effects. And as I've shared with the supplements, there's always a risk of something not quite going the way you want it to. I think that's a really big red flag. And my Peter Salerno talks about traumatic cognitive dissonance, doesn't he? We're going to go off on another tangent here, just as you want to end. But the traumatic cognitive dissonance is when you're coming out of these systems, you're going, well, I see so many people getting benefit from it. And that is true. I've actually had some benefit from doing this work and using this method. The problem is when you transition or pivot from using it to solve a particular problem that you have right now, when you pivot to believing that method is the one true way, and the fact that the organization is reinforcing that belief whilst denying any potential downside and indirectly kind of guiding you away from other methods or modes that could be helpful for you, which is another, that would probably be for another episode, the indirect direction of saying, Joe Dispenza's a clever guy, but Deepak Chopra's a clever guy, but Jordan Peterson's a clever guy, but there's always a downward social comparison between the leader of this organization and anybody else who may be considered competition. And that is another hallmark of rank narcissism, by the way. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Great and very interesting. And I hope we get to speak again soon. Probably on social media at the moment. I haven't been active for a while for reasons that we've kind of discussed here. While I've been sorting out my authentic self from, I was in the position of, I was going to develop the business with the model that I'd learned that I've now distanced myself from. So I'm having to reshuffle a lot of things. Facebook, it's just it's David Hompes, Hompes. Dave Hompes on Instagram. Yeah, we drop them into the notes.